yogic path of awareness begins with spiritual inquiry, which begins with self-acquaintance. To inquire means to turn our full attention in a specific direction, to have a direct and immediate encounter with the physical, energetic, emotional, and mental realms of ourself. To encourage this depth of mindfulness means looking at ourself without prejudice or preference. As soon as there is prejudice, our perception gets distorted, and our attention is bound up in reactive patterns. To free these constricted habits of body and mind, we have to be willing first to relax our defensive structures, and then to embrace what we notice with compassionate acceptance. Transformation is possible for anyone who re-educates themselves and applies more skillful ways of being, while simultaneously allowing for a non-judgmental acceptance of reality as it is. A seeming paradox indeed. In Buddhist language, this is the marriage of method and wisdom. This is the jewel, the gift of the yogic path. Energized ease of being, and if meditation is added, the potential for both insight into our conditioned patterns and the freedom to relax into our unconditioned true nature. Namaste. Namaste. Welcome. Let's sit together for a few moments in silence. And let's bring the hands together. And setting our foundation before we begin the formal practice by recommitting to the yogic path. And I'll share the words of a meditation teacher, Stephen Batchelor, who uses languaging that I appreciate so much. And if you feel it speaks to you, then utilize that as well, or create something that's more personal for you. And his words are, I vow to awaken for the benefit of all beings. I appreciate its value, and I feel it is possible in this life as I am. can seal that intention in by bowing if that feels appropriate. And just sitting upright again for a few moments with the eyes closed. And before we begin the asana practice, let's remember that just as important as what we practice is how we practice, our inner alignment. So keeping a keen eye on observing the reactive patterns as we go through the practice. That can enable us to free up the constricting ways of being. The inner abodes of the awakened ones is often described as a vast awareness that is expansive and unbound by circumstances. So as we go through the tools to open the body, we can begin to free our minds from clinging to the ideas we hold about how we think things should be, and also creating the aversion then to how things are. So let's watch this tendency towards craving and aversion to diminish the constrictive control they can have over us, and the shielding of pristine awareness. So developing compassionate attention to the habits of the body and mind with an interest in freeing both. So we begin the asana practice in the yin style, both to create more suppleness at the core and encourage our awareness into the center. So let's bring our feet together in butterfly pose, like Baddha Konasana, but extending the heels quite forward of your pelvis. You can sit your hips a little higher than your feet, up on a blanket or a cushion, particularly if the hips are challenged in forward bends and they tend then to recede back when you intend to come forward. We want to have this pelvic tilt available to us, and higher hips assist that. So just with hands on the ankles, and again the eyes closed for a moment, let's begin with concentration on the breath, a primary anchor throughout the practice of asana. And remembering that the tattva, or the guiding principle of all hatha yoga, is the increased distribution of prana flow. And we can assist this mobilization of energy through ujjayi breathing. This slow down diaphragmatic breath with a soft sound in the back of the throat, kind of like waves beginning under the ocean. Not a strong projected sound, but even from beginning to end, and the length about 5 seconds or so for both an inhale and then match the exhale to that same length. And then if you're also interested in the practice of Mula Bandha, we can encourage this prana flow toward the core of the body and the purification of these central channels through this subtle lift at the base of the chakra system, the mula. So take your awareness to the perineum, this little diamond-shaped muscle between the anus and the genitals, and feel how you can press down on it, or you can lightly pull in, like when you try not to go to the bathroom. Mula Bandha, or to seal or bind the energy there from dissipating outward, is when on inhale and exhale, so it's a static contraction, we just lightly lift in at the region of the perineum. And yogi suggests this encourages the prana flow toward the center and allows the apana then to potentially be more upward drawing. And I encourage you to study more about subtle body anatomy so that this practice can come to life for you. And I need to assume that you have been practicing and studying yoga asana and philosophy for a few years for us to practice together in this session. And I'll use the language of the yogic, Taoist, and Buddhist systems for descriptive purposes to bring insights to the way that we can practice. And so now, in taking the first yin pose, and I'll describe the practice through my understanding as taught by Paul Grilly, we can think of it just having three simple tenets. And the first is just taking the suggested shape or asana. So here our feet are in front of us in butterfly. And then finding your appropriate edge. So if you want to increase sensation now on your next exhale, you can come forward and just come to where the sensation is not neutral, but it's tolerable. It's not extreme either. The second tenet then, once we've taken the shape that we feel is appropriate for us personally, non-comparative with others or with your own body even yesterday or the last time you practiced, then the second aspect is that we become still and we allow our muscles to become soft. So we're not pulling ourselves further into it. We're not holding ourselves deeper in it. So there's a relaxed quality. And the structure is just folded over the bones in this shape. If you have any neck or upper back challenges, and this is tugging too much to drop your head, and the head is not resting in the feet, then you can find ways to support your head, either bending the elbows as they sit in the feet so your chin can rest in your hands, or if you want to be lower, stacking the fists, putting your forehead down on them, or even using a pillow between your feet and forehead. The third aspect of this practice, which you've already begun, is to hold for longer periods than other styles. So we'll do 5-minute increments in each pose. So 3 tenets. Appropriate edge in the shape. Becoming still and passive. And holding for time. Meanwhile, you're flowing with the Ujjayi breathing, attending to that inward lift at the root, at the mula. And as the sensations intensify over time, saturating these areas with breath through flowing your attention into them. Now, in the same way that Hatha Yoga from India utilizes a phrasing that describes polar opposites of Ha and Ta, or receptive and active elements, being joined into a harmonious union through a yoking or yoga, the Taoist system from China uses the language of yin and yang to reflect on these polar opposites of receptivity and activity. And it's said that when yin and yang are in balance, one is in harmony with the Tao, or the universal mystery of life. So I'll use these Taoist terms, yin and yang, instead of Ha and Ta, to describe and investigate how we affect various layers of our being during yoga asana. So those elements that are described as yin would be those characteristics which are more yielding, less mobile, cooler, lower or more earth-directed, feminine, and more hidden or toward the center or core of things. Conversely, elements that would be described as yang would be those that are more active, elastic, warmer, masculine, higher, and more obvious or near the surface. We'll inhale now and come up. Stretching out the knees in front of us. On the exhale, and then let's do saddle pose next. So let's bring our feet back. And you may want to have more padding than just a mat for the yin practice. You won't need your sticky mats until we shift to the yang practice. So you can put a blanket across it or have a cushion if you feel bone to mat is too hard of contact. So we sit on the heels in Vajrasana, the heels just on either side of the sit bones. And then we'll come back. These next two poses are sacral releases. They really assist the sacrum, which is pulled down away from its home in the lumbar with all of our chair sitting in cars and planes and restaurants. And it allows it to be freed up and in. So we're going to go back to increase that shape and affect those tissues around the sacrum. So if you're all right with coming onto your elbows, if not, just stay on your hands and just lean back. You needn't tuck your tailbone or squeeze your thighs together. Just let your legs be relaxed. If being on your elbows is fine, you can come onto the top of your head or onto your back. Saddle pose, we call it in the yin style. If a knee is resistant to going back in this shape, then you can do half saddle and just stretch that leg out, more like a half version of Supta Virasana. If both knees can't sit back in this way, then in this next pose we'll do, you can do 2 rounds of and just come onto your belly and take like a sphinx pose with the hands around the elbows to also affect sacral tissues without any risk to the knees. So once you're in the pose, then the 3 tenets apply. We get to a position we feel is tolerable, not risky, no sharp electrical pain. Dull, achy pain is to be expected. We breathe into that because we're asking more of the tissues than usual. Then we get still, we soften, and we hold for time. So in being reminded of these descriptive terms that represent polar opposites in nature, we can recognize that we too are composed of yin and yang tissues, yin and yang emotions, yin and yang ways of being and behavior. So how this can benefit us as yoga enthusiasts is to recognize that how we do these asanas will affect yin tissues or yang tissues depending on how we take the poses. So if yin is a term described for those things which are more restive and closer to the core, quieter, then we could say anatomically that this describes the connective tissues around our joints, those tendons and ligaments that connect muscle to bone or bone to bone. Conversely, we can think of muscle tissue, which is more near the surface and more elastic, more mobile, enjoys activity, as being more yang tissue. So a yoga practice that targets its effects at the joints and is soft or passive in the muscles, we could call a yin practice, whereas one that involves rhythmic movement and engages muscle to protect the joints, we could say is a yang practice. So we're starting our yoga asana sequencing with the yin style. Yin tissues don't respond to pressure or exercise in the same way that yang tissues. A guiding principle of any exercise is bringing appropriate use or stress to certain tissues, and then, if appropriate, rest is given later. The body automatically moves into its repair response, where it sends circulation, nutrients, blood flow, prana flow to the area that's been used, thereby enabling it to become more usable in the future. Hence the need for repetition to increase strength and mobility. But as we know from our exploration of yoga asana that engages muscle, we constantly have to be aware of protecting this deeper, less elastic connective tissue when we move around. Because these yin tissues don't have the same fluid content, so they don't stretch like muscles do. And if we move aggressively or inattentively, we can tear or damage them. This is why so much time is spent in any good yoga class on proper alignment, for safety and for more freedom and ease and consciousness in the body. So if yin tissues don't stretch, then what are we doing? Well, in a moment, we're going to come out. So just take 3 more breaths here. And by the way, if ever you feel the need to come out before the timer, if it starts to feel unintegral and you feel anxiety or like it's risky, then please honor that feedback. And we'll inhale and come up. Use your elbows, your hands, your stomach muscles, because your back has been quite passive and we don't want to try and use the back to get up. And then come forward on your belly and just leave your legs out behind you like a forward Shavasana for a couple of moments. This will help stretch out the knees from the last pose. Whereas a regular counter pose might be downward facing dog after Supta Vajrasana, we want to stay in the yin mode here in this first hour and then shift to those other ways of practice. So all the while, your concentration is with Ujjayi breath, with lubricating the whole body through your attention flowing into the areas where sensation is strong and when it's subtle, like now. The area that you just taxed through that last pose is more receptive, more absorbent through having utilized it. So continue to send your breath into where it was just intense. Refresh the area by continual attention. So if yin tissues, without their high fluid content, don't stretch per se, we can still create space and circulation in these areas through utilizing the tissues in a safe, consistent manner. We're not interested in excessive hypermobility, but we are interested in more range of motion at the core, which will enable us to sit still comfortably longer for our meditations and give us more freedom of movement in our yang practice and throughout activities in our life. So yin tissues, although they aren't interested in being exercised like yang tissues, which love rhythmic movement because that pumps up their fluid content, and so they, through use, become stronger and more mobile, more flexible. Yin tissues, on the other hand, require a yin kind of activity, as we're doing. So let's come into another back bend now to still be giving attention to the sacral region, which tends to really stagnate on anyone, even those with really hypermobile elbows and knees. Everybody's sacral and lower back area can get rigid through just lifestyle. So you can have your hands around your elbows or out in front hands like a sphinx, or we call it seal in the yin, which is a straight-armed cobra. Just walk your hands in so that you rest in the bones. You don't bend the arms, or that starts to engage the muscle tissue and you can't hold it for long periods. You turn the hands a little out, and then you just drape your navel toward the floor. Instead of pulling your navel towards your spine and hugging your tailbone to the ground, which we do in more yang styles, here you allow and exaggerate the lumbar curve. Hugging in your buttocks and inner thighs is fine if that feels appropriate to protect your back. But we do want to be relaxed in the back muscles, the erector spinae and the serratus and latissimus muscles of the back, so that we target the effect of this pose into the longitudinal ligaments which run along your spine line between the vertebrae. If you get any kind of shooting pain, electrical pain, feeling of nerve pressure, then you're too deep in the back bend. And see if coming to Sphinx, or even on your ribs with just your arms outstretched, relieves that sensation. Okay. Eyes or gaze, the drishti, can be just downward and still, like an open eye meditation, or you can close the eyes if that doesn't cause a dull, sleepy kind of consciousness. We want to stay with sharp clarity of mind. And like a spinal wash, just draping your attention downward on the inhale, like you're lubricating the whole spine line, down to the mula, subtle lifting in, if that practice is of interest to you, and then an exhale where you rise up. Toward the chest. It will prevent you from collapsing the chest at the end of exhale when the air is flushed out. Keep that kind of buoyancy, that upward lift in the heart space. So although we usually associate exercise with movement, that is particular to yang activity. Here, while we're being still, we are actually exercising tissues through these stable pressure on the space between the bones. We're affecting the yin tissues, which require static long holds, more like stretching taffy slowly. You know, it'll just snap if you move it quickly, but if you slowly pull it apart, connective tissue is a little more like that. But it's living tissue, it's not inert like taffy, so it also has this pulsation running through it. In yogic subtle body anatomy, we've heard about and understand that this interest in asana is to mobilize this inner currents or prana flow through the nadis, similar to the idea of moving qi through the meridians in Chinese acupuncture theories. But interestingly, some of the major roadblocks to this qi flow is our joints. And if this highly elaborate information system that's within us is linked up to the health of our organs, and the major roadblocks occur at those junctures where there's connective tissue, then it can be highly motivating for us to recognize that when we take a practice like this of still held postures, we're stimulating the qi flow through these regions of connective tissue to balance and stabilize the organ system as well. An imbalance in the meridian system reflects an imbalance in the organ system. So remembering this and understanding these concepts can motivate our practice, can help concentrate our attention through the interest in bringing a core awareness. Because taking the pose and creating the pressure is one way to mobilize qi flow, just as needles are another way. But the two other ways are through the concentration of your mind and the flow of your breath. So every time we get distracted, and inevitably we all do, we're hoping to train up a non-reactive awareness that we were distracted, so free of assessment or judgment, we just tug our attention back to body consciousness, energy awareness. and particularly in the yin, to surrendering into sensations, not fighting them, not gripping inwardly to hold ourselves in the pose, but draping more, softening, yielding. These are yin qualities of our being that are cultivated in a yin practice. And now it's 5 minutes, so we'll exhale. And you can bend the elbows and then move them to the sides and come down for a few breaths, flat to the floor. And just notice how the temperature now may cool some. It warms up the longer you're in the pose. So sensitizing yourself to just the naked truth of sensations as they move through us. And then with the hands underneath you, inhale slowly back to child's pose. You may take a few breaths as you're taking the sacrum the other direction. Just relax the forehead down and the buttocks towards the feet. Still breathing all in and around that sacral region. Notice if the length of breath is still the same as when you're challenged in the pose. So that even when we're in a more neutral shape, we're interested in keeping our attention crisp. Let's bring the hands just forward for a moment to take the knees wide, and the next pose being wide knee child's pose. So similar to what you were in a moment ago, but your knees as wide as they're willing to go. You're still sitting back into your feet and then resting on your elbows or down on your chest. Appropriately stimulating or utilizing the tissues of the inner thighs and groins. One of the benefits to this style of practice that was noticed and vocalized by a yogi named Hiroshi Motoyama, a teacher of mine, but more of Paul Grilly's for many years, was a blending of the understanding of which particular meridians are affected by which poses.